Than 10 minutes, but I got a lot of stuff done. Anyway, I guess we needed a break. Alright, so we just looked at some stuff about events, event listeners, and I'm going to try and mix it up a little bit. Now we're going to look at some source code. We're going to go into Android, Eclipse, and we're going to look at some source code. What we're going to look at is this one here. It's called events, and events is going to come from here, just so that you know where it's coming from. It's coming from bhacker.com. Oh, I don't have internet access. That's good. One moment, please. Looks like the internet's running a bit slow. Wow. Okay. This usually means that oh, there we go. Usually means the internet connection is slow. Spring 2013, Android phone application development, tutorials. This one is called Events. There's two of them here. There's one's called Events Lecture/Tutorial. I'm going to go over this one in a few minutes. And then we have Events Solution. So here's how this one works. Events Solution, if you double click on the file, opens it up. We have a subfolder called AP Events. I got Events 1, Events 2, Events 3, Events 4, Events 5, and Events 6 inside of here. We have a bunch of different little events in here. So if we double click on Events 1 as an example, and Events 2, we unzip each one of them. I've already got them loaded, so I don't have to do this, but you're going to need to do this. Then you have an entire folder for Events 1. So in my Android folder, let me close logging because I don't need this one anymore. I have Events 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. You may not necessarily want to load them all, but start out with Events 1. Let me refresh your memory on how to load Events 1. I'm going to take this Events 1 and delete it. I'll delete it completely. Actually, I'm going to delete it out of my workspace folder as well so I can load it back in. So this is how we load it in. I've downloaded it. It's out here on in a folder called the AP Events. I'm actually going to make my life easier and just stick it on the desktop out here. So I've unzipped Events 1 and it's on my desktop. And this is for those people who missed this last time or who didn't have everything installed and couldn't follow along last time. How do we get the project inside of Eclipse? This is how we're going to do it. I'm going to click File, Imports. I just copied it onto my desktop and I'm importing an existing project into the workspace. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. If this isn't opened up, you want to open up the Generals tab and click on Existing Projects into Workspace. Because these are all existing projects. Click on Next. Click on the Browse to pick the folder. It was called Events 1. I stick it on the desktop. So Desktop Events 1. All you have to do is pick the folder and then click on Open. You don't have to click anything inside of here, by the way. Just click Open. It should find Events 1. And it should show up in this little window here where it says Projects. I guess I could have stuck them all inside of one folder, but I didn't. So, long story short, it's all separated out. Go ahead and click on Finish, and now you see Events 1 is now back, and it's now back into my list here. This is how you're going to get TA. Could you tell them that I need that door open for ventilation, and I can't have people talking in there. Oh, sorry. Questions on, I know there's a little edge there. Questions on how to get the folders, how to get the projects inside of Eclipse. This is kind of important if you want to follow along with the example. So if I did this, and now I'm going to open up Events, instead of going through following step by step, cutting and pasting and sticking stuff into the code, I've pre-built them for you. I've actually pre-built the other tutorials for you as well. But I think in the intermediate stage we can get through a lot more examples by not building. We will build some this afternoon, but the stuff that we've done already, I'm not going to go ahead and go through and build another 50 applications this way. So it's just a little bit too time consuming. Not only that, but it's all the same. We know how to go file new, create a new Android application. We know how to We know how to change the XML file for the interface. We know how to add strings, hopefully. So we're going to build on that knowledge a little bit. We know how to create events, activities. So if we open up the events one, we can see we have two. We have a color setter, kind of like a name getter. And we have a events one example. So I'm going to focus more on the code itself, which is heavily documented, and this actually comes from a set of examples that's provided with a really nice book. And the book has what's called tutorial lectures in them. And this is one of them that you're looking at now. And the book itself is down here. If you go to this website, don't recommend the book actually, which is kind of counterintuitive. I like the author's examples. I don't like his writing style. It's a little long-winded. If you think I'm long-winded, you should see this guy. It's just too much reading, and I don't like it. But I love his examples, however. And just to give credit where credit is due, these examples are coming from Marty Hall's book. Marty Hall is his name. It's from 2012. It's based not on the current. It's about one API behind us right now. He makes this available open source. I shouldn't say open source. He does training and stuff, but for university academic settings, he provides his materials for free. So, and his code examples are fabulous. They're very well documented. They're very well structured, and I really like them actually. So rather than reinventing the wheel myself, I have taken his stuff, and I've actually kind of cut out a few of his slides as well to make it a little bit more brief as well. So he's a little long-winded. Alright, so what does this example look at? We're going to look at using the separate listener classes. So this is a different example than what we went through a few minutes ago, or this morning I should say, when we looked at the listeners for the button and the radio boxes and the check boxes and all that stuff. But it's the same content presented in a slightly different way with a different example. So if you didn't get it before, maybe you'll get it now. If you got it before, then this will just make it even better. So we're going to look at using named inner classes. We're also going to look at using anonymous inner classes. So we're going to talk about the inner class concept, using the main activity, which we've seen so far, and having an implemented listener interface. So this is the implementation example, so right. And then using the main activity and specifying the method and the layout for the main.xml file. Copying and renaming Eclipse projects, well, we've done that. We basically did that. So using the separate listener class. So the goal here of this particular application that we're going to look at in a few minutes here is to change the color of a text view when a button or a radio button is being pressed. So we press a button, it's going to change the color of a text view. So we have a class that's going to do that for us. It's going to be called the color change. So different colors depend on which button is pressed. So I'm going to run the application so you can kind of see what we're looking at. So let's take a look here. I'm going to run events 1, and we'll kind of see the functionality, and we'll see how it's composed, which will give you a little bit more of a hand. And then you can change. Now that we don't have to cut and paste and stuff, you can actually play around with the code a little bit, and it's more guaranteed to work for you as well, obviously, because it's already created. Here's my button interface. So I've got buttons. The buttons that says red is selected by default. And if I click on this button here, I have red that shows up on the bottom, and I have blue, and I have yellow. Then I have a red, a blue, and a yellow. So we're looking at the implementation. Same thing we looked at actually. We just looked at the theory of it, but let's just take a look. And I highly recommend playing around with it maybe. Moving the buttons around, changing the functionality a little bit, because then you can actually kind of see what's going on. But that's the finished product for the first part of this, and we're going to move gradually into more complicated stuff. But let's take a look. And so the approach that we're going to use, so the goal is to change the color of a text view. That's a text view. We'll see that in a few minutes. That's down below the buttons and the radio parts. So the approach is we're going to use an external class, and the external class is going to implement the View.OnClickListener from import Android view on click listener. We saw that. And then says implements an on-click listener. So we're basically going to use a class that does it instead of putting it in the onCreate method, which is a little bit more streamlined and it's more reusable. If we put it in a class, then we can take the code and we can use it elsewhere over and over again. Because one of the things that the best parts about object-oriented programming is the reusability part of it. If you hard code everything inside of every onCreate method that you're going to do, you're not necessarily going to be able to reuse it further down the road. So advantages here is you can pass the arguments to change behaviors. You can separate the classes, generally promoting a loose coupling. You don't want things heavily coupled. What does that mean? Well, this weekend's all about design, by the way, and the intermediate parts of Android development is, anyone can put an Android application together. Can you put one together that's logical, that has a very low level of coupling, that has high functionality to it, that's streamlined, that's reusable? Because what you want to do is be able to pick up, oh, I did that before. Okay, so take and use that class in something new. Coupling means how closely tied are all of the methods and classes, and how interchangeable. If we make it loose, they're interchangeable. If everything's got to be tied down and bolted in thousands of different places, not very reusable. So what we want to do is have loose coupling, which means one little connection. We just include this and we make an instance of this, and voila, we got it. And then we want to do this again. Well, we just take and we put it in that project over there, and voila, we got it again. So it makes our life a little bit easier, because once you've created one email application, one spinner application, one list view, one view group of anything, don't reinvent the wheel. Just use it again. It was basically the design pattern. So separate classes generally promote loose coupling, which is what we want. There's actually two words they call in software engineering. It's cohesion and coupling. You want a high level of cohesion and a low level of coupling. Coupling is how many connections are there that are needed to make something work. And then cohesion is how functional is the class on its own. So you want a class that does something to do it all. And you make it so it can adapt and be use it in inheritance. So a high level of cohesion. It has a high level of identity, which means if it's a printing class, it's just doing printing, but it's printing everything. It's doing a nice job printing it. And then it doesn't require very much support by other classes. What you don't want is 1,000 different classes that all do the same thing, or that all require each other. You see this when you open up projects and it's got 25 different activities in there. Whoa! Or it's got multiple activities, main 1, main 2, main 3, main 4. And you're like, what in the world is all this stuff about? That's really bad design. Okay. Disadvantages: if you want to call the code in the main activity, you need a reference. You do. You actually have to make an instance of the object. A little bit more work for something of this level. And even then, the code in main activity must be public. Yes, it must be public. So here's a summary of our layout. We saw this actually live a few minutes ago. What we're looking at is a vertical linear layout, and we have 3 buttons on there. A horizontal radio group containing 3 radio buttons, and then we have a text view on the bottom. So right now, if you flip back to the pre-written code, and if you open up the resource folder, you can see it live and change it around if you want. And in the resource folder in the layout, we have main. If I double click on main, I see the picture that's in the slide set. And then if I click on the main XML file, I see my linear layout. This is the beauty of having it already put together for you. And I see I've got a button, button 1, button 2, button 3. I guess I could have called them, or they could have been labeled red button, blue button, and yellow button. But they're red button, they're button 1, button 2, button 3. So, and then I've got a radio group, and the radio group is holding. And this is the other interesting thing I thought I'd mention in terms of style, which is why I really like these code examples. Very nice styling. So we've got a radio group. Inside of the radio group, we've got 1, 2, 3 radio buttons. Notice the indentation. So I can easily see this radio group's got these 3 buttons inside of them, and the 3 buttons aren't standing out on their own. So there's no law that says these have to be indented. In fact, you can pull them out this way. But if you indent them, then it's clearly able to see that these 3 buttons are inside of this radio group. So some of it's coding style as well. That's really nice. Plus, he also uses Java docs, and you can use Java docs inside of your Android projects, just the same way as you can use Java docs inside of your non-Android projects. And Java docs automatically creates the documentation for you, but it requires that as you're writing the code, you're internally documenting it, putting in the keywords and putting in the key things. So you press a button and you generate Java docs. And Java docs most people see online, actually. They all look like the same format. You can change the format of them. But it's a way of internally documenting your code so that, 5 years down the road you can look at it and go, hey, what was that? What was that button in there for? So anyway, we have the radio group, and then we have one radio group. We have 4 buttons, and we have a radio, 3 buttons. We have a radio group with 3 buttons inside of it. And then we have this text field that's on the bottom. The text field is called color region. So we're not. We have a string here on the text for the button. It says it's going to be for the yellow prompt, the blue prompt, and the red prompt. But it's a very basic XML file. You could probably put your own together at this level. After attending the first meeting, you probably, I would hope, be able to assemble this particular interface. If not, take a look at the graphical part of it and see what you missed. So here we have the Java doc kind of, well, it's actually not, this one is not Java docked as I mentioned that, but it's definitely internally documented, which is really nice. What we're looking at is the main activity that's called events1 example. So that was the XML file. If I come back up here, I've got 2 things to look at. I've got the color setter, which is the class that's going to set the colors for us, which, again, for this is kind of overkill, but it's showing a nice design pattern, where we're going to have our on-click listener. And so let me follow back through on the tutorial here. So, for vertical layout, let's see. The tutorial, if you want some more information and you missed the first meeting, you're still not getting the layout concept, you can go through this. It's a lot slower pace than what I'm doing right now. But here's a orientation, the vertical, setting the buttons, the same thing we just looked at live actually a few minutes ago. A little text view. We also have string values set. If you remember that before, we have the red prompt, the green prompt, the blue prompt that were set as strings for the text, and we're using the strings file. So if we take a look at strings in here, another thing important to note that inside of the resource, inside of the values, refresh your memory on that one, inside of the values folders are strings. Our strings are carrying all of the labels. Our application name, our red prompt, our blue prompt, and our yellow prompt. That's showing up as the text for each one of the prompts. So, important to remember that. Now let's take a look at our main activity here. So this part, this essentially is creating has the onCreate. So this one's going to be called events1 example that extends activity. And we have a private view color region. So let me go back to the code that's live because this is a little bit bigger here.
Excuse me, Doc.
Yes.
Can you give me an example of internal Java doc here?
Oh, I know. As I said that, and then I looked at this and I went, oh, this isn't Java docked. This one in particular doesn't have Java docs in it. There is, and if you go into, are you also in the Java program? You're not. In the Java programming lecture, I did a video on Java docs. I'm also going to be covering it in the weekend class. I have it actually for you, and I have a good example for you as well. It's in the Java folder though on vhacker.com. I don't actually have it. I wasn't planning on covering Java docs for this class, but if you go, I believe they added it to the Android developer.com. If you search on Java docs, they might actually have an Android project with it in there. It's nothing more than creating, before each one of the methods and before each one of the classes, you create they're like tags actually. It's almost like creating XML tags using the comments, where you have a title and you have a definition and you have and what it does is a Java docs is a parser that goes through, takes all those comments, parses them out, puts them into key value kind of format, and it makes a nice little HTML interface out of it. And then you can post that online and people can go through and look at your methods and see what you've got. But as I was looking at this here, I'm going, well, don't necessarily see an example of that going on here. But some of his other ones have Java docs in them. I believe he may not, he definitely may not have done it for most of these examples, but the Java ones have it though, which is interesting. So this is, what we're looking at here is the color setter. And the color setter is the main brains of the operation. The example 1 is the main activity. Could have called it main activity. This is just called example 1. So in here, this is the code that's starting in the PowerPoint actually, or the PDF file that's showing you the main view, which is the data type for M color region. So the coding style convention says that non-public instance variables here should start with an M for member, as in data member or member variable. So again, some of the comments that are in here are for his coding style, which I really like actually. I don't follow it 100%. I follow some of it, but he actually is a little bit, what's the word for it? Programmers can be like type A or type B personalities. I was going to say anal retentive, but that's like the type A. I'm a little bit that way in terms of the type A qualities, but I get sloppy. This guy is like extreme type A. Like even like everything, I know that's why I kind of like it, because he's really disciplined in terms of coding style, and so his examples, believe it or not, are really easy to read. So that's when I found this guy online. I went, wow, this is like the best stuff I've ever seen in terms of doing something correctly, especially for teaching purposes. It's very, very nice. All right, so not only does he have major documentation, but he's definitely using for data member. So this one here is a private data member. So M for member, this is what he's putting in here. I don't do that, but as an example, this is a member variable. It is a private data member because it is inside of, in fact, if you left off the word private, this, which is what I do all the time, I would leave that out actually, because it is private by default. So some of the coding examples have everything you could possibly imagine inside of it, which you could probably leave out half of the syntax. We have a view. So going back to the view concept, it's a generic component that says it's going to show up on our UI. It's going to be an XML view component, not a view group, but a view. And the view here is going to be M color region. And so initializes an app when it is first created here for the onCreate method. That we're familiar with. And this is going to be a main activity, or example 1 extends activity. We're familiar with that already as well. And what have we got in here? We're going to set the context view to main, no big brainer. That's the main activity that we're looking at. You have to set the context view before you can run the find view by ID. Actually, we've seen that in most of our examples. So here's the big part here. We're going to use the find view by ID. And when the ID is going to be for all of the IDs we just looked at for button 1, button 2, button 3, etc. That's in the XML file of the interface. We're going to create, and this is, okay, so this is where he and I differ a little bit, because again, I'd make these into private data members as well. But, because I'd stick up here, my coding examples will have all the text buttons and the button, everything is defined as a data member, and then I'll assign the data members. But this is not to say that it's just a different style here. You can say button 1, button R1. So it's the definition and the initialization all done together inside of the onCreate method, which means it's only visible inside of onCreate. It's not a global variable for the entire project, which means in this particular case, if I wanted to extend this to use some of the other activity states, I wouldn't be able to see this particular variable. So once you start building applications, this is one of the things you're going to run into. You're going to go, well, I have that button. I have a button, radio button R1. and I want to use it when the application ends, but how come it's telling me it doesn't know what button B1 is? Well, then if you went up here and you added a radio button, which is the button type, radio button, and you want to call this one R1, you put it up here, and then down here you did R1. Well, it's going to be visible now throughout the entire application and throughout the entire activity, excuse me, not application, instead of it just being visible inside of onCreate method. But either way, works just fine. For this particular example, it's just a different style as I was mentioning before. I don't want it in both places, you also want it in one place. Okay, so we have the radio buttons, 1, 2, and 3. And then here's the interesting part. We're setting the on-click listener, and the on-click listener, this is the different part. This is the color setter. So on-click listener is going to be a new color setter. So we're creating a new class that's going to be used inside of this class that's going to represent our on-click listener, because we don't want to stick it in here. We could stick it in here. I just showed you how to do it in the last examples, but we're sticking it into a different class to abstract it out to make it a little bit easier to look at in the future and to use in the future. So we have our color setter. Well, that's this class over here. So this color setter over here is going to be used inside of this class over here. So we've got an inner class here. So it gives an example. First example uses a 6. This is of 6, but this one uses a separate non-inner class. Excuse me, it's a non-inner class, but it's for the event handler. An inner class is generally a class that's defined inside of a class. This class is not defined inside of the class. The class is defined outside of the class, but the class is representing the listener, the observer, or the listener, instead of, and in the event handler, instead of putting the code in here, which makes this kind of nice. Look how small it is. It's really small code, actually. So the onCreate, we just create references to these items, and we put the listener on each one of the items. Believe it or not, you don't have to download all of these examples because they're all doing the same thing. It's just the code's designed 6 different ways. So it's kind of showing you the variations between the two, or between the 6, I should say. But so color.red this, color.blue this, color.yellow, red, blue, yellow, depending upon whether it's a button or a radio button. And then we're going to set the color of the color region. So this is the color region, is the view at the bottom of the main window. It's a text view. So we're going to set the region color to a color. So this is the view, M color region, set background color. Well, M color region is going to be, M color region up here is going to be assigned the color region. The color region, this is the ID. The color region is in our layout here. And the color region is right here. But this is the text view. The variable that we're using it with is a view. So a view is a view is a view. A text view is a view. A button is a view. A radio button is a view. Edit text is a view. They're all views because they all come from the same class. They're all coming from view.something. So long story short, it's a generic reference to an object, so it can change. So if we keep it as a view and we use this color setter, then we can take and set the background color of a button, set the background color of a list box or something. It's just a view component. It makes it generic for reusability sakes. We could have just set it, this is a text field. Could have set it as a text field if we wanted to. Alright, so we're going to set the background color. And what it's going to do is going to take a color in, and the color is going to be run from the set region color. We'll set region color, so it sets the color of the color region colors inside of the view at the bottom of the box. So how's this going to work? Well, we've set the color with the color setter. The color setter, let's take a look at that for a few minutes here. This is the event handler. So color setter is going to implement OnClickListener. We don't have an OnClickListener implemented in our main activity. Instead, we have it in the color setter activity. So in here, we're also going to have an integer myRegionColor, and another one here. We're going to include this activity, and this activity is this. Excuse me, not include. We're going to make an instance, a private instance, because the color setter class is going to work with the main activity class. The main activity class is called events1 example. That includes our onCreate method in there. It's creating the activity that's running, that's parsing the XML file, that's creating all the information that we want. We're going to read and write to that as a component or as an object. So we're making an object reference. It is of type, just like if we created a people.class and we create a people1. This is events1 example, which is the name of the class, main activity class. So then we have a constructor, which constructs a color setter event, stores the color and the main activity, and then we have the onClick method that we'll use the two objects to call back to the main action activity, specified color. So color setter, here's the name of the class. We know this is a constructor because it has the same name as the class name, and it's going to take on a region color, and it's also going to take on the class that's coming from it, which is the main activity. So events1 example. So if we look at the call to this object over here, we see it has two parameters. This is the name of this class. This class happens to be event1 example .class when we compile it. It's also taking on color.red. Well, color is a color, so red is the name of the color. So it's taking on a color value along with this, which is our cells. So our constructor is taking these two things here, and it's taking the myRegionColors, having it equal to the color that we're sending into it. And then the main activity, well, it's this. This is going to be sending main activity, so we're just setting the main activity. Why do we need to do that? Because we can't set this in this action listener, in the onClickListener over here. We don't know about this. This is a different class. So if we want to get the main class that we're working with, we pass it through the constructor to say, and then we can make this anything. It happens to be hard set to, as an example, it happens to be set to the examples. Events1 example is the class type. We can make it a generic object type if we wanted to, and have it work with any type of activity class instead of just this one. So call back to the main activity to set the color. The onClick event is going to be setting the color. So main activity, well, that's this that we sent it. Dot set region color. Set region color. Isn't that a method call? Yeah. Set region color to the color. So if I come back over here and I go, well, set region color. I remember seeing that down here. Set region color to the color. So we have a button. It's in a main activity class. We press the button. The onClickListener is going to another class outside of this class. We're passing to this other class the color and then ourselves, who we are. So then this other class is passing us back to the main activity with the color and who you are and what button you want to, what you're going to change. And then down here, it's going to set the color for us back here. A lot of work just to set the color of an item. So for something this small, probably could have just stuck it in the main onCreate method and just changed the color really easily. But what if we had a different type of functionality? And what if you had multiple different activities? You don't have to repeat in every single one of those activities all of this onClick behavior. You put it in an onClick class. You send that class who you are and what color you're going to change. You put the listener on the different items. When the event is captured, it goes to the class with the information that it needs to send to create, and here's how it's going to it. The set onClickListener is going to create a new color setter with this color and who we are. So class A, main activity A, main activity B, main activity C, main activity D can all use this one listener class. And the listener class is going to take on the color, and it's going to take on who we are, and it's going to send us back and set the color for us automatically. It's going to respond to the event. You have one responder with as many classes as you want, long story short. We only have one class in this particular case, but we could be using this more generically in a bigger project with a lot more different types of classes. So when you're looking at the example, don't think, oh, that's how it is overkill for what it's doing, but it's showing you a design pattern. That's what it's showing you. So if you look at the tutorial notes, it actually kind of goes through all of the different text for all of the different activities here. New color setters assigns a separate class as the event handler. Good news, you can pass arguments to the event handler, which is what we're doing. We're passing the argument of the color along with the handler class, who we are, this. And then over here, since the method will be called by the main in a separate event handler class, it's just a public method called setRegion that's taking on the color. And it's going to set the background color of my region. Well, what do we set the my region as? That's a view. That's going to be a generic text box, text view that we've gotten here. So the event handler in here, this .main event handler is going to be equal to the main activity. We've set over here. Oh, that's the next example. We've moved forward. Nope, no we haven't. We're in here. So we've set this inside of color setter. We're setting this, and the main activity here that we've got is this awareness of this object that we're going to receive a message from, which is our main activity. And that's going to be identified as main activity. So class number 2 is making awareness of class number 1, so we can talk back to class number 1. So it's going to talk and use class number 1 as a private instance variable when that instance gets created of class number 2. Digest it. Think about it. It's 1 of 6. It's not that complicated, really. It's not that bad. Only problem with this is it's overkill for the size of a program it really is. It's kind of a lot of work to create a separate class to do the event handling, and that's all we're doing in that class. We've just basically, instead of putting the event handling in the main activity class, we created another class for it entirely. So a lot of people would actually put it inside instead of outside, which is what we're going to see next, actually. So, in terms of the event handler here, the results on the emulator, we looked at that a few minutes ago. That's the behavior that we're looking at. Just going to change the color of the text view that's underneath it to red, blue, or yellow, depending upon which button or which radio we're selecting. And in the code, actually, we have, oops, let me find my code here again. The listener is on the radio buttons and then also the buttons. So it's on all of the components. We're putting on the, here they are actually, here the same, whoops, didn't mean to do that, edit undo. The same set on-click listener is going on all of the components themselves. Okay, so results on the physical phone are the changes. So instead of putting it outside in a separate class that we called color setter, and we passed the information, we made an instance of that class by passing information to it, use the constructor, send the color and who we are so we can change the color. We can do the same thing by using a named inner class with the event handler. So the goal here is to change the color of the text view, same thing as we had before, using the radio buttons and the buttons themselves, just as a previous example here, but the approach here is going to be the inner class that implements the View.OnClickListener. This one is a little bit more straightforward. We started with a harder example. We're actually working towards the easier stuff, because eventually we'll just put it in the same class. Just to let you know that there's like 6 different ways of doing this. Okay, so the advantages here, you can pass arguments to change the behavior. Event handler method can access private data activity. It's all private. We don't have to make it public. We had to make the other one public in order to share it among different classes. And no reference is needed to call to the activity. We needed a reference of the activity in the outer class. Here, if we put it together, we don't need to make a reference to it. Disadvantage. Since the listener class is in the same file as the activity, it's more tightly coupled. So you cannot be changed independently. So the advantage we have over doing this overkill technique is we only write it once. And we can use it over and over and over and over again because it's outside. So that was the advantage. We can change it. The argument's going to change the behavior. We can use the argument, create generic arguments with generic view components, very loosely coupled, reusable. But the disadvantage on this one is we don't want to call the code in the main activity. You need to reference it, which means you have to go through the process of creating a reference for it. And then you got a lot of code. And then the main activity has to be public. So here the main activity can be private. We can keep things inside and keep things closely knit, but we've got a lot of coupling going on. So going back to that concept of coupling, this is tighter. This is not as loose. Because it's just almost like when you do assignment number 1 and you stick 5 classes inside of it and you put inner classes inside of those classes, hard to break it apart. And you're like, well, what is assignment number 1? Further down the road, you don't even know what it is. I don't even know what it is, seriously. But, I mean, I'm just like a generically assignment. So, okay, so the XML files are the same as the previous example, so we don't have to worry about that. The main activity is going to be a little bit different. Let's go take a look at the main activity, actually. So I have it loaded up. You can unzip now assignment events 2 and load it up into your project. I'm going to close this one so I can remember which one I'm looking at. No saving of any changes here. So number 2, I can quickly notice I have events 2 example, no color getter or setter. Well, it was called color setter. Remember I had 2 classes in the previous example? Now I only have 1 class, 1 main activity class. So if I double click on the main activity class, let me close down example 1 here. Close this one down too. Okay, so now I have the same concept as before. I'm still using the view, and I still have the extends activity. I still got my onCreate method, and I still got everything else going on inside of it. The code is actually identical, but instead I put the color setter now inside of it. It's just inside the same file. You put it inside the same file, it's now become an inner class. When you compile it, you're still going to get color setter.class that comes out of it. If you take a look at the compiled components that come out of here, well, if this were not an Android, actually the bin might show the different classes. Yeah, the bin actually does show the different classes. We have an APK file because this is Java. Java is Java. Take a .java file, compile it, turns into a .class file. Take the .class files, put them together into a .apk file, put it on an Android phone, which is what we covered last time in the first meeting. So we still have the components, the layout, the string. Actually, here it is here, color setter. But we can see that it's an inner class because we've got events 2 examples, and then we have this $sign that separates them out. It says color setter. If you did the same thing with a regular old Java file, you get the same results when you compile it. If you put them in 2 separate text files and compile them separately, you get them labeled differently. Is the functionality identical? Yep. Only thing is that now you can make things more private because the scope is inside. If this class is an inner class inside of the other class, then it can share the information without going outside. So initialize the app when it's first created here with the onCreate method. Same as before, same code that we just looked at a few minutes ago. Only difference now is we set the color here with this color setter that implements onClickListener. So we have private integer region color. So it constructs a color setter event handler and stores the color. The onClick method will be used to use the color to call back the set region color method. So here's our color setter. We're still sending color setter the region color. But here we've gotten rid of a parameter. So we don't have to send it this anymore. This is this. We just use this. So before we were sending this, which was the main activity, to this other class that was outside of ourselves. Now because it's inner, it's a little less complex. We don't send it this because we already know who we are. It's not leaving us. It's inside of us. So we only have one parameter that we're sending to it. So we sort of rewrote it a little bit here. Here's the construct. The constructor, excuse me, that's only taking on one, and the constructor is taking this dot region color to equal region color. Well, where's this dot region color coming from? It's this region color that we put in the class here. So it's still kind of abstractly in an inner class. It's not in the outer class. A little bit easier. I don't have to run it. We already know what it's going to do. Same thing as the other one did. So let's see. There's a couple more ways of doing this, believe it or not. So let's see. How about using an anonymous inner class for the event handler? So instead of calling it color setter, let's not give it a name. Let's just make it. Why do we want to give it a name? We're never going to call it outside of that class. It's part of that class. So here's the idea here. Randomly change the color, same thing as we did before. Use an anonymous inner class that implements the listener. So we're going to look at anonymous classes, assuming that each class is applied to a single control only. Some advantages, same advantages as the inner class, but shorter, less code, actually. Approach is widely used with Swing, AWT, GWT. So if you've taken my Java class, this is what we've done actually in the Swing examples. Disadvantage. If you applied the handler to more than one control, you have to cut and paste the code for the handler. We did this anonymous listener in one of the examples. I can't remember which one it was, but one of the button examples that we did in the first weekend, we did it this way. Easier. The approach should be applied to a single control only. And if the code for the handler is long, it makes the code harder and longer to read and makes it all hard. More code to write. And the approach is usually used only when the handler code is short and simple. So this one is number 3. And the layout is identical. The resource is identical. So let's take a look at number 3 here. Why do we need to know that there's 6 different ways of doing it? Actually, this is just 6 different ways of doing it. Why do we? Because it actually demonstrates different concepts. It's all about the design. I mean, actually, Java is really flexible this way. You can do it like many different ways as you want, but which design is going to lead itself better to the best pattern, I guess, is the choice. So here we have a simple event handler, third example here of 6. Uses a named inner class. This approach is a previous example, compares an upcoming example with an anonymous class. Wait a minute, did I? Okay, I have 2 of them named the same thing. Is this one using a named inner class? Color randomizer implements OnClickListener. I forgot the named inner class. So we used an inner class, now we're going to use a named inner class. And then the next one's going to be an anonymous inner class. So same approach as before. I accidentally skipped this one here. It's trivial because it's the same thing, but instead of making it an inner, we just named it. So initializes the app here with the onCreate. And the difference between this one here is that we have the whole method being used for it. So the region is going to be find the region. We're going to have a button on here. The button's going to take an OnClickListener. We're going to run the method color randomizer. And so we have an OnClickListener that we're going to set color. And the OnClickListener here is going to take random generator is equal to a new random. It's going to randomly generate the colors for us. So the color choices here are going to be set in an index, an array of color choices that's going to be randomly generated, and we're just going to, on the click, it's going to change the color for us. So it's pretty much doing similar activity as before, but it's running this method here instead of sending it a parameter. It's randomly generating it, and we've named this color randomizer, and it's implementing the OnClickListener, and the OnClickListener is going to be on a click. So on the OnClickListener, we're creating a new inner class color randomizer that's going to do some different functionality. Very similar to the inner class example I just gave you a few minutes ago, which is probably how I skipped by it. I just didn't really think about it. Let's take a look at this one here. I should number these differently. This is the one that uses the anonymous inner class. The other one, not too interesting. This one's a little bit more interesting. So events, for example, extends activity, and we have an array here of different colors, and we're going to set up an integer array of my color choices. I've got about 6 of them different here. So we're going to use the onCreate method, and we're going to set the we're going to get out of the R resource layout the color region, which is going to be that text field. We're going to change the color of again, same as before. The button color button is going to be equal to the color button, and then we're going to say color button set OnClickListener to new OnClickListener. This is what we did last weekend, or the first weekend of this class. This is the first OnClickListener we set. It's an anonymous listener. We're not setting up a special class to do it. Instead, it's inside of this class and right underneath it. So here's what makes it anonymous. We have the set OnClickListener, and then within the same branch here we have an opening bracket, and then down here I have a closing bracket with a semicolon at the end of it. I nested inside a call to the onClick event. So this is really the OnClickListener set with the anonymous class that's inside of it. Who's the class? Well, it's really ourselves. Our class is our class that we're going to set. And what we've got going on here then is the OnClickListener for the random number generator. It's just the same listener that we did before in the named class, but we're putting it inside of this class. So what makes this anonymous is that there is no class. It's us. We just nested the click event inside of it. So this is what we did the first weekend, and we had one for button 1, one for button 2, one for button 3, and you have to do it for each individual item. Not very efficient, although very straightforward. If you only have one button and the behavior is very small, you can stick it all inside of this anonymous kind of way of doing it. We still have the method out here, and the method out here is just going to set the color region to a color. And the method here is being called in here, set color region. And we're not specifying what object to run it on, we're just saying run this method. So set color region color, set color region color down here. So we can kind of sort of see how this is simple. This is the first thing we did actually with the button listener. So when we actually use the button listener. If you don't want to do this, then you put it on the XML file like what the other thing we did. But that is not as extendable either. So that's the anonymous method. We have more methods as well. And usually at this point people are like, what method should I use? Depends on what you're doing with it. If your entire application only has one listener and you only have one button you're going to listen to, that's a much better approach, wouldn't you think? But if you have like 5 or 6, you have a GUI intense application with a ton of buttons, a ton of checkboxes, then I'm going to use probably a separate class for it. If it's going to be routine behavior, let's say for example a form checker. You know, when your user changes something, you want to make sure the passwords match. You want to make sure things are capitalized. The telephone number actually has a telephone number in it, not text. You need to do form checking. I create a separate class completely for that. And then run the form checker. And then every time I had a form checker, I can always check to see if this password is 7 characters long. I can put all the methods in there for all of the different checks for everything in there, and I can make it more generic. It's kind of like how people write JavaScript, actually. You can put JavaScript inside. You can put it inside, like inline, or you can put it in the header file. You can put it outside. And you're going to put it outside for one itsy bitsy little thing you're going to run. Probably not. But if you're going to run a lot of stuff, form checkers, you usually include it inside of a JS file and put all the code inside of a file. Okay, this is number 5. Let's take a look to see what number 5 is about. Don't worry, we are going to go to lunch eventually. As soon as we finish these 6 examples, we're on number 5. We're almost there. Don't worry about it. I know we took like a late lunch today, but later than normal. Alright, so we have the inner class. Attempt number 1 is with a name class. Okay. Anonymous class, we just saw that a few minutes ago. We're putting the code inside. And here's the anonymous part of it, or the red part here. We're putting the OnClickListener inside of the set OnClickListener. So the method is running the kind of way here. And the results look like this on the emulator. This one's going to pick up. Actually, the GUI changed a little bit because this one only has 1 button on it. And the previous example only has 1 button on it because it would be too much work to write 4 buttons, 3 buttons. The first one we can have 6 buttons on it, and we have one class that does it all. A lot less work. So it's sort of also demonstrating the concept as well. So with 1 button, and you got to repeat the code 6 times for 6 different buttons on there, which is not so efficient when you think about it. All right. So now we can have a main activity implement a listener interface. Well, isn't that what we just spent the morning looking at? We did. Probably the most generic way of doing it. So the randomly change the colors, the approach. I'm just going to go down to the advantages. Assuming that the app has only a single control of that listener type, this is the shortest and simplest of the approaches. What if we have more control? What if we want to put more listeners of the same event type? We're stuck. So this one works, makes it more generic than the anonymous class or the inline classes. But the drawback here is that scale is poorly to multiple controls unless you have completely identical behavior. If you want all the buttons to respond the same way, if you want all the text boxes to respond the same way, this way works great. If you want different listeners for different behaviors on the same controls, you're SOL. Because it doesn't work. So it has some limitations to it, which is why you create an external class and you do it that way. Okay, so if you assign this to the event handler for more than one control of the same listener type, the onClick or whatever you put in there, that method, would have to have cumbersome if statements to see which control was actually pressed. It wasn't that cumbersome when we had the radio boxes and the check boxes, because that's what we did. So the approach should be applied only when your app has only a single control of the same listener type. So you cannot pass arguments to the listener. So again, it works poorly for multiple controls. So this one is, I believe, number 5. So let's take a look here. Implements the OnClickListener. So one of the things important to note here is, oh, we have 5 opened up already. So let me take a look at 4 real quick here. On number 4, you can easily tell the differences between these here. When we're using from 4, 3, 2, 1, all the way back to the original, we didn't use the interface. We extended activity, and then in here we put on the OnClickListener, and then we put in the click event, whether we put it into a separate class or we used it in the same class, anonymously or named. But we never once extended the listener class. Instead, over here in the imports, we're going to import View.OnClickListener. So starting with number 5, we're implementing the interface. So we're using the interface class, which makes it different. And here it is here, implements OnClickListener. So you know you're doing this technique when you're implementing the interface, but how many times can you implement the interface all in one class? One time. That's what the problem is. Well, it's not really a problem. Depends on the application you're building. What kind of logic are you putting into this thing is what the problem is. So give a simple event handler here. The 5th example uses the main class as the event handler. Satisfy the Java's strict type checking and activity implements the appropriate listener. So now we have the same code as before, but we have an onCreate method here. We've added the listener, set onClickListener, and then down here on the bottom we have the onClick, and we're going to generate a random number, and we're going to use it this way. This is not an anonymous inner class because it's outside of the class. It's inside of the same class definition, but it's not nested inside of the set onClickListener event. So if you look at the placement of this, it's different than in the nested environments. So nesting means you're putting it next to the listener. It's all part of the same statement. It only works on that particular button. So if you pull it outside, implement the interface, and then what you're going to end up having then is this is going to be outside, not nested. And then it's going to work with all the buttons, but only of the same button type. So here we're not checking anything. If we wanted to, we can go back and look at those examples that you looked at earlier today and go, if it's button 1, if the ID is button 2, if the ID is button 3, if the ID is button 4, then we've got the listener to respond inside of the generic class. Okay, so that one was number 5. And the important part here is it implements the onClickListener, and then we set the onClickListener. Results in the emulator are going to look the same as before. If you're running, you'll see it. Results on the physical phone are going to look the same as before. So handling events by specifying the event handler method in the main.xml. This is the one everyone liked. I could tell in your faces when we first put it in, everyone went, oh, that's easier. This is putting it in the XML file, putting the onClick event in there. So let's see what the advantages and disadvantages are. Advantages, assuming that the app only has a single control for that listener. Mostly the same advantages as a short, simple code. Same thing as we did before. As the previous approach. More consistent with the do layout in XML strategy. Requires that you have the XML interface. You cannot do it programmatically. You have to do it with the XML interface in order to do that. You can supply different method names for different controls. So you're not nearly as limited as in the interface approach. Because this one, on this method click, on this button click, on this event, we're going to run this method. On this one, we're going to run that method. Here's the disadvantages. You can't pass arguments to the listener. So it's going to do something or not do something. You can't pass information in. Less clear to Java developers which method is the handler for each control. We don't know. Since no override, no warning until runtime if the method is spelled wrong or has the wrong arguments or the wrong signature. It has a tendency to cause errors at runtime that are not detectable at any other time. And makes code, if you can make the code break, compile it, it runs, but when you click the button, nothing goes wrong. It's a terrible thing to have to debug. But if it's for a simple button and you just want to put it on there, makes sense, actually. So, and most people liked that when they saw it. So, we did an example of this last time. So let's see. I'll show you what's different here. We have to go into the bin. No, excuse me. Into the resource directory, into layouts. If I click on main.xml, here it is here. OnClick. So Android.onClick. I've seen this in a lot of code. Actually, a lot of code examples will do this. It's probably the easiest way of doing it. But you can't pass any arguments to it, and it doesn't error check. So you're taking the risk. So if we look at the code for it, we just have a method in there, but there's no way of telling what that method is for. We're just going to run this method here. Here's the method. So it's called when the view button is clicked. But how do you know that this is the method that's supposed to be for the onClick event? It accomplishes the same thing as the onClick listener, but it's weaker because it's prone to errors. And you have to set it for each one, and you have to use the XML interface for that. Actually, I shouldn't say that. It's commonly done with the XML interface. I believe it will probably work if you do the XML programmatically. It should work, but I'm not sure you can set the property. I'm not sure if the property exists to be set programmatically. I know it can be set on the XML. So. Well, we've already seen this one. We did an example of it last time as well. So let's take a look here. I believe it's going to be the same as we've seen before. Those are all of your different ways of setting the onClick listener. Believe it or not, every single event is done the same way. We've got 6 or 7. Well, this is just 6 variations. There's variations of the 6 variations as well. But essentially, to each his own in terms of the design. I would not just pick one and do that one constantly, because you're going to lend yourself to a bad design eventually. Plus, you're going to open up the application to potential errors and stuff like that too. Alright, so we got some more fun stuff to do after lunch, but I think we need a lunch break. It's almost 1 o'clock. So let's take a lunch break. Let me stop this video.